All right, so let me ask you a question. How many of you think your life is a story? Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is, how many of you imagine yourselves as being the star of a movie that began at birth and is going to run to your death? Raise your hands. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. The world is full of movie stars, even if it's only in your own mind. Really, is that all? You don't see it that way. All right, how about the rest of you? You, Superman. How do you see your life, if not as a story? Sad story. Well, that's maybe. Signifying nothing. All right, okay, but that's still a story, isn't it?
Yeah, but it doesn't have like a particular climax.
Well, not yet.
No, that's why it's not a story yet.
I see. But you expect that it may become a story in time? Maybe in 20 years you'll have a story. But not now, you're too, right. I got you. Okay. All right, I can see that. Now, essentially, most people in the world do view their lives as a story. That's the common view. Your life is a story. It's got a beginning, it's got a middle, it's got an end. More to the point, it's got a plot. Okay? Things follow each other. One goes on to the next, goes on to the next, goes on to the next. Now, I'm sure you've seen people, and maybe some of you are these people, who at 18, 19, or 20 have a plan. They have their entire lives mapped out, right? They're going to go to school and they're going to become a doctor or whatever the case might be. And then after they become a doctor, they're going to marry such and such, and they're going to live in such and such place, and they're going to live happily ever after, and this is how it's going to go. You know anybody like that? Yeah, no? They don't exist anymore?
No, I destroyed all their dreams.
Oh, personally. But you've been busy. Right. Well, I know people like that. Except I don't really regard them as people. I regard them as space aliens, as visitors from another planet, because that's not really how I see life at all. And in fact, okay, not only do I not see life as having a plot prospectively, which is the way these people see it, but I don't even see life as having a plot retrospectively, which is how most people see it. The problem is, in the world, most of us are victims of narrative. The only way we can remember anything about anything ever is to tell a story about it. This is what we do. And this is what we do with regard to our own lives as well. We tell a story about it. Now, this seems like a harmless enough affair. After all, it's a little story. What's a story going to hurt you? Okay. But there are problems with doing this. And first I'm going to tell you some of the problems, and then I'm going to tell you another way of living and being which possibly avoids some of these problems, although it gets you into other problems of its own because life is hard and there's just no way to solve all your problems, and that's just the way things are. Okay? But the problems with narrative are essentially twofold. One is, and I wrote this in the book, it was nobody's favorite aphorism, but it is one of my favorite aphorisms, which is, the more you tell a story about your life, the more you edit it. Okay? Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is, if you have a story, it's got to have like a particular plot line. Things have to fit together in a certain way. Okay? And if there are certain events or incidents or thoughts or unpleasantnesses or even pleasantnesses, if it comes to that, that don't fit in with your self-conception, with your storyline, you will just edit them out. And at first, you will edit them out when you're talking about yourself to other people. But after you do that for a while, you'll start fooling yourself, and these things will literally disappear from your life. You will no longer have these things. So the problem with the story is that everything has to fit into the story. And if it doesn't fit into the story, it disappears. And when I say disappears, I mean literally disappears, okay? As in Orwell's 1984, it has dropped down the memory hole. And you lose great chunks of your own life, many of which may be potentially valuable. And the reason you lose these chunks is that you have to discard them in the interest of preserving your particular narration, whatever that might be. This is kind of a problem, or at least I regard it as a problem. Maybe for people who, have these stories, they don't regard it as a problem, but I regard it as a problem. But there's another problem, which is sort of the opposite side of the same coin, and the problem is this. When you regard your life as a story, you become too wedded to your past selves. You see, when you walk into class today, you're this particular person at this particular time. This is your identity, but it's not your permanent identity. What did I do?
You lost the former self.
Yeah, that's right.
Technical difficulties. Not that difficult, though.
Not that difficult. All right, we're back. Okay? This is yourself as of this moment. Next week, yourself may be something else. Last week, yourself was certainly something else. Last year, yourself was something else yet. And so on and so on and so on. Now, the question becomes with narrative, to what extent you are wedded to your past and to your future selves. I regard narrative as being excessively wedded to your past self, or at least your past self as you construct it. Emerson talks somewhere about a foolish consistency. And a narrative view of oneself tends to promote a foolish consistency. Why? Because it's all one story, right? You can't change too much because however you were last week, you sort of have to be this week, okay? And if you're not that way this week, it's because you've lost the thread of the plot to a certain degree. You become excessively wedded to your past self. So basically narrative does two things for you. One, it drops out half of your life, and the other is that it makes the other half of your life excessively coherent to the way you are now. Have you ever asked yourself why, if you've held a particular opinion for a while, or a particular belief for a while, or you've liked a particular food for a while, or a particular movie for a while, it's so difficult to change your mind about anything? One of the reasons is because of narrative. It's because you feel like if you changed your mind about this, you would somehow be betraying yourself. But you wouldn't really be betraying yourself. You'd be betraying your past self. And your past self is an entirely different person from your present self. So now, I guess you're going to ask me, well, look, if I'm not going to treat my life as a story, how am I going to treat it? How am I going to regard it? What's my identity like? Well, there's another way to do this. And you can sort of regard yourself as kind of a snake that sheds its skin progressively. And this is the way it can be with regard to your past selves. This is kind of the way I am. And I shouldn't recommend it to everybody in the world because not everybody in the world is going to be this way. It depends on, any number of other factors. But the way I always was is that I never regarded my past selves as having much, if anything, to do with my future self. This is why if yesterday I said something and defended some position vociferously, okay, I can turn around today and say the opposite and defend that, equally well. I'm acknowledging that my past self is obviously input into whatever I am at present. Whatever I am at present is in some sense, okay, the sum of everything that's gone on in my past. But the fact that it's the sum of everything that's gone on in my past does not mean I have any allegiance to those past selves. I have no particular allegiance to the way I was last week, or last month, or last year. And there's no reason you have to have that particular allegiance either. So what I'm saying is, if you want to be intellectually flexible and you want to have the ability to change your mind, and you want some sort of openness to, some future experiences that you haven't encountered before, and more important, if you want to remember and use what's actually gone on in your life instead of the stuff that you make up about what's actually gone on in your life, then one way to do it is to discard narration insofar as it's possible. And that's